Hello. Yeah, it's on. Thanks, fuck. Right. Water would be great. Yeah. Uh, cool. So
Yeah,
just straight into my.
you can do it to do the intro.
Yeah, if that's all right.
Hi everyone. We're just about to get started in 1 wee minute, so do a couple of star jumps if you like, and then take a wee seat and we'll just get going. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Uh, yeah, surprise me. Anthropocene architecture school. Yeah, I can even just the we're now starting or something. I can cover anything else. We're all good. This is now just a bit silly. So it's all good.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for our last exciting, I think, hopefully, talk from Scott from Anthropocene Architecture School. Okay, I'm just going to take the stage.
All right. So yeah, this is it's not how. So yeah, thank you very much for coming. So the whole point of this talk is really looking beyond COP26, because we've kind of seen that the built environment is not really looked at as a positive impact. So I'm not that tall. Thank you very much. Awesome. So this is all about reimagining what the built environment is in terms of what's already possible and challenging the horizons that we've had set by our educations, our practice, and typically just how we've kind of been brought up believing buildings can't go beyond a certain kind of standard. So I'll introduce myself, really kind of slightly one-page CV. But 2.5 years ago, I unintentionally founded a School of Architecture. I currently practice in web archetype, and I co-direct Anthropocene project CIC. So I put kind of climate justice and activism at the heart of all the work that I do. So everything I do is trying to put that front and center. So when I was in architecture school, I was profoundly failed in being prepared to design sustainable buildings. And that wasn't that long ago, and many students are still in the same boat. So when I was in university, I went to do natural building projects and volunteer on them, just kind of as and when possible, to really bulk up that knowledge I wasn't being given by my studies. So that's just kind of really whirlwind tour of why this person is speaking to you. So the Anthropocene Architecture School started out as a kind of one-off protest at the Architecture Fringe in 2019. And it's since kind of spiraled, and I then started being asked, what's next, what do we do? And it grew really, really organically. So this went from kind of a one-off, we're going to have a dialogue, to being invited into practices, to I've taught educators a few schools of architecture as well. So before COVID-19 made everything that we did most of the time inside for a year, this is what that work typically would look like. So top kind of left was, if you're going to found a new School of Architecture, one of the best places inside a really beautiful historic building. So this is the Britannia Panopticon at 2019's Architecture Fringe. And this then took that work with Extinction Rebellion to the Edinburgh Fringe, as well as part of their summer hall sorts of residency. This kind of ended up being invited to address the RIS National Convention, I was asked to set the tone for a climate emergency because frankly, it still really isn't there. The response is there's so much inertia, there is blatant apathy, and we're still kind of not just there. And that kind of went on into things just this year as part of the Climate Fringe 2 months ago, I think it was in September, held Scotland's first ever People's Assembly on climate and housing justice. So at no point before have we taken tenants unions, trade unions, the public, architects, engineers, put all of them in one room and actually empowered them to have discussions about housing policy. Because all the housing policy that we pass is effectively climate policy because of that impact. They're totally inseparable issues. And this was just giving people the agency to start discussing them. So it's some incredible speeches from the STUC, Living Rent, and from kind of retrofit co-ops as well. So just to kind of a little bit more context, the Anthropocene Architecture School is now kind of taught across continents, which is a little bit silly. There's no building, there's no admin staff, there's no PR team, but it still gets quite a bit of work. So this has now led to teaching about 4,500 people in 2.5 years with very, very little capital means resources at all, just in a very kind of agile way. But this is what it looks like when a School of Architecture takes the climate emergency seriously. Because today's talk is the 100th event the Anthropocene Architecture School has been involved in. So this is a sort of 100th milestone in 2.5 years. So if your School of Architecture has done any less than 100 events, they're a bit behind. So that's just setting the bar and making that nice and open as well. So just to kind of ground the context of where we are. So the left-hand side of this graph, there's only a few graphs to start. We'll get them out of the way, it'll be fun in the end. So the left-hand side is where we are today. So kind of your conventional practice is accepting that when buildings are designed, they're going to do environmental damage. It's just building to code, it's the bare legal minimum. And the bare legal minimum during a climate emergency simply isn't good enough. You move slightly along, you get to kind of green and high performance buildings. They understand that buildings can actually perform quite well, but they still accept they're going to do environmental damage. We then move into what's sort of held up as the best, so sustainable design. But what sustainable design is practiced as effectively is damage control. It's aiming for doing no damage. When realistically you can push beyond that into the right-hand side, so that's more regenerative or restorative design. So it's entirely feasible and possible, and there are examples of buildings being better for the environment than them not being built. And the fact that that's not the bare legal minimum is an outrage during a climate emergency. So the part of this talk where it'll get fun is when we go through some of the examples of things we are told on a regular basis cannot be done, but have been done in practice. But when you're bringing this in, we do need to understand that at the same time, this has never been involved in architectural education for decades. We have decades of practitioners, of architects, engineers, civil engineers, who've not had climate literacy in their education through no fault of their own whatsoever. This is no attack. This is just an observation of fact. So when we kind of distill what climate literacy is, it's understanding the impact something has on climate change, whilst understanding the impact climate change has on that. So, for example, the buildings we have designed historically are not ready for the changing climate that we're going to be facing. But at the same time, they all have the opportunity to be made more resilient, and through that resilience can be improving public health, creating green jobs, and it's understanding where the opportunities are. So climate literacy is not just it's not a tick box exercise. It's not the little diagram you've done just so you pass your end of year exams. It's about a mindset and approaching the built environment in a profoundly different way. That's not how it's been taught historically. Because when we talk about sustainability, we really love to talk about energy and carbon. So these are two things we can talk about. They're very numerical, they're good for statistics, they're easy to write on paper, but this is the world system diagram. So it really, really succinctly shows that when we're talking about sustainability, we can't do that without looking at our cultural and world views. Health and well-being come into that, and as climate change intensifies, resource and water availability is also going to come into that. So it's looking at the interconnectedness of everything. The way we've designed buildings before has looked at putting them into essentially a stale, non-existent vacuum. It's entirely impossible to design with an isolation because the world we live in is interconnected on a deep level as well. So we now have we've had before mentioned the construction industry is sometimes called the 40% industry because about 38 to 39% of entry-level carbon emissions come from our built environments. So everything on this graph that is not blue is something that if you work in architecture or construction, you can positively impact. But also that's 39% of opportunities to reduce carbon emissions. But this is not being spoken about at COP26 in any way that can be deemed serious. So it turns out that in these international negotiations, there is no talk about international regulation of the minimum baselines. But it's really important to understand this impacts everybody, and not just in one country. This is a global thing. So every building we design has a global impact on carbon emissions. And to make things very, very blunt and succinct, the Committee on Climate Change has said that unless we almost entirely decarbonise our built environment in the UK, we will not hit net zero. That's entirely impossible. Without decarbonising buildings, without taking this seriously immediately, we do not hit a single climate target. And that's not an exaggeration, that's just fact. So without decarbonising all the buildings already standing up, and without guaranteeing the ones being built today and tomorrow are going to be effectively net zero, we're not going to hit net zero whatsoever. So that's just the state of play and where we are. But to kind of take the global picture and to make it more in tune to the UK, we're looking at about 49% of the UK's carbon emissions. So unless we entirely reduce that to zero, we don't hit net zero in the UK. So again, that's 49% of what's happening, and it's something that's not being spoken about in serious terms in government either in the UK. But this is, again, a global issue. So the really big kind of boxes that have just appeared are showing where the responsibility for the climate emergency lies. So this graphic shows who's responsible for carbon emissions historically. And very succinctly, and to make it concise, 92% of these carbon emissions were emitted in the global north. So we have a responsibility to not just decarbonise by 2050, but anything later than 2030 is hampering other countries' efforts and using up more than our fair share of the carbon budget. Because when we've had 92% emitted in the global north, most of the impacts are already being felt and have been felt for decades, if not centuries, in the global south. So this is a question of justice. So if we are not ensuring the built environment is going to be net zero or absolute zero as fast as possible, this climate injustice is going to continue and be perpetuated, impacting people globally. Because the left-hand side of the screen has now become the 1850s and the right-hand side has just become today. So this is just looking at global temperature rises, just globally to see what's happening. So the closer to red we get on the right-hand side, the warmer things are getting. Things are picking up. We've got about 1.2 degrees locked in already, and we're still moving onwards. But there is a huge gap between what's being done and what's being declared and what's actually taking place. So even just as of today, there's now this kind of new looking at where do we stand in terms of the commitments at COP and the commitments of countries internationally. So we can see that in COP, the commitments in place are not going to get us to 1.5 degrees. And 1.5 degrees is the ethical minimum bar. If we go above 1.5 degrees, several countries are underwater, several countries have already lost land. So this is not just something that can be back burner for 2025, 2030. If there's not immediate milestone actions taking place as of next year, these commitments are failing profoundly and as effectively betraying people. So we talk about degrees and numbers of degrees quite often, but we're going to do a whistle-stop tour on what that actually means for people, because this is incredibly important to understand. So if we go to 1.5 degrees, there's a 14% increase in kind of extreme heat. People globally exposed to extreme temperatures. But at 2 degrees, that's more than double, that's 37, so more than a 2.5 times increase. When we look at kind of, say, ice-free Arctics in the summer, that's 10 times worse at 2 degrees. And sea level rise is a conservative estimate of 6 centimetres higher. So we bear in mind how many people globally live around coastlines. Any sea level rise affects millions of people. But we're also in the 6th mass extinction event. So if we go to 2 degrees as opposed to 1.5, we lose twice as many vertebrates, twice as many plants, and 3 times as many insects. So keeping this in check is not just about kind of looking after human life, it's also non-human life. It's the biodiversity and ecosystems that we cannot survive without, and people depend on for livelihoods and sustenance as well. So even looking at kind of what does it look like when you go beyond that as well, because we are on track for overshooting 2 degrees at this point. So when you look at between kind of, it's not a linear increase, this is pretty much almost exponential. So at 1.5 degrees, there's a 3% chance of ice-free Arctic summers. At 3 degrees, it's 63% chance. That's more than 20 times worse with a 1.5 degree difference. We then look at kind of the length of droughts. So at 1.5 degrees, the length of your average drought is going to be 2 months. At 3 degrees, that's 10 months. That's almost perpetual. If we look at kind of wildfires, there'll be a 41% increase at 1.5, but at 3 degrees, it's 97. So this is not just a small, slight multiplication. This is exponential. And if we look at what's already happening, we've had the melting of Arctic sea ice faster than the IPCC actually mentioned it was going to happen, and we're seeing a domino kind of cascading effect on what's happening with these kind of planetary systems. So this is what's already happening before this kind of 1.5 degree things even came close. So you might have heard kind of in 2018, there was this report that came out, and this is the one that shocked everyone. This was before Extinction Rebellion appears. This was before we had the kind of any debate of net zero. And this very, very bluntly said, we need to hit zero carbon emissions, kind of absolute carbon neutral by 2050. And at the same time, it said countries that are industrialized and have effectively benefited from extractivism and colonialism needs to decarbonize significantly faster for that to be just. So just to make that report that's very long and very sad and very upsetting, 2 sentences. But you probably kind of wondered as well, we talk about how fast we're doing this. So this has been illustrated incredibly well. So this is just charting out different pathways of us reaching net zero by 2050. So the really important thing to remember is that carbon emissions are accumulative. So this is not a question of everything we do is the same. So when you look at it actually, and you take those graphs and you make it more numerical, the slowest pathway emits 4 times as much carbon as it does by going as fast as possible. Most IPCC pathways and most of our government's recommendations are based on carbon capture and storage technologies that do not exist at scale. Degrowth scenarios have still not been explored by the IPCC, and we're still kind of in this same space of just doing what we've done before, but of a net zero sticker, or hoping that carbon capture and storage and future generations will clean up the mess that's already been kicked into motion. So to really just spell out where are we today, right now, and what does that look like? So you've probably seen Kate Raworth's kind of donut economics, really charting where we are as a planet economically and environmentally in one pretty diagram. But that came from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So these are 17 different goals on eradicating poverty, increasing kind of equality as a whole, and also kind of addressing climate change. But this has been overlaid with the planetary boundaries. So these are different boundaries in our planetary system that if we overshoot, there's a very high likelihood we will not come back from that. But we do not know the ramifications of any one of these boundaries being surpassed. So in one sentence, we are not meeting the needs of all people on the planet equally or justly, and we've overshot 9 boundaries that we know of. So that's where we are, and that's great. So now it's your turn. So this is because I've done this 100 times. So everyone's going to do some talking. You've all hopefully got someone around you. So first of all, we're going to have a little bit of active listening. So what I'd like everyone to do, we're going to do this for 5 minutes. I'll time it and then make sure we don't overshoot. Is something we do not give enough time to is speaking about how we actually feel about the climate emergency and climate change. The first time I ever did this, it was tested on landscape architects, who I thought spoke about it often. But when you ask 100 landscape architects how many of them have, it's about 6, and they're very shy. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to shut up for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to start talking again. But you're going to find a pair, and just how do you feel about the climate crisis? But you're going to take turns. So the first person will speak for 2 minutes, and then last get swap over, and others speak for 2 minutes. So we're just going to give that some time, and we're going to start now. And I'll continue in 5 minutes. Right, we're halfway through, so we've got 2 more minutes, and we'll jump on with stuff as well. All right, we're just going to continue. So thank you for playing along. And if everyone could just wind down so we're quiet again, thank you very much. Awesome. So all right, we're going to continue. So the important thing here is also recognizing, as Naomi Klein said really eloquently and really succinctly in her latest book, we are alive at the last possible moment when changing course can really mean saving lives on an unimaginable scale. So this isn't just about carbon, this isn't just about economics, this is about literally saving lives. So everything we do in the built environment has a huge impact, and that's something we can always remember, that everything we do can have, and ultimately can effectively have a positive impact if we push hard enough. But kind of responses to the climate emergency they've varied wildly. So even before the IPCC report in 2018 was ever even kind of published, Greta Thunberg's solo school strike for climate began outside the Swedish Parliament, and that snowballed to 7.6 million people being on strike on the first ever global strike for climate in 2019, which is pretty amazing. But at the same time, in 2018, there's two parallels. So at the same time as Extinction Rebellion dropped some really blunt, really honest, and very factually accurate banners off of bridges in London, the Sunrise Movement were occupying the Speaker of the House's offices, demanding a Green New Deal with support from senators. But when you look at the kind of bottom right of these images, this is what it looks like when our government had their first ever net zero discussion. We had less than 30 of over 600 of our elected representatives, and several of them are actually asleep. So the gap between what's necessary, what's happening, and what the people in power actually think needs to be done is vastly different. So again, we're just going to show you this a couple of times. This is why what we do is so important. That 39% can be an incredibly positive one. I want to really challenge everyone to instead of just saying we want to reduce it, we want to transform it. We want the 40% industry to be at least negative 10% industry. We have the capability of decarbonising the built environment far faster than we do of decarbonising anything like transport, aviation, shipping. We have the technology right now. So just in that kind of respect, at the same time, we have a really unique kind of place. We can illustrate what the future can look like in every single thing we do. We can be shaping these kind of behaviours and policies as we design. And every single architecture school exhibition could effectively be a window into what the future could look like if we were taking this seriously. And if students are not being prepared to imagine that, and they're not leaving university feeling they can change the world, they're being failed by that university. And during a climate emergency, we don't really have time for that. And when we look at what architects can actually affect, we can look into behavioural and psychology and economics. So kind of when it comes to factors upon people's decision making, the one of these factors we can actually affect is how we're presenting information. So all the other ones we don't really have much control over, but what we can be doing is creating these new social norms and creative, conducive environments. So whether that be speaking at a fringe event at COP26, encouraging people to do that, or whether that's a teach-in, whether that's another space, and practicing these norms as well, so embodying them and not simply saying them and doing kind of quite radically differently. But at the same time, we all have quite a lot of agency. We don't give ourselves enough credit for what's actually possible. Sometimes when it comes to things like protest, it's easier to walk into a road and to block it when someone else does. But just at this moment right now, every single person in this room could call any member of their family and talk to them about could they do more around climate change? What would they be willing to help them with? You could effectively go, right now, you could pick up your phone, you could email your boss. You could pick up your phone, you could email your MP. You have the agency to do several things immediately that we've just been kind of socially conditioned to think this is a little bit embarrassing and a little bit cringy. But beyond that, what we do impacts the people in the same kind of sphere, our colleagues and our peers. You go beyond that and it's into our community. So what does your work look like to the outside world in the city you're based in? What are you doing? How does it impact people? But then we can go beyond that entirely. We can look into panarchy, systems of systems of systems. So everything that we do does have a knock-on effect, whether that be one project you do inspires a client to do something differently. You've done one thing, you've challenged a client, and they've taken that back to their boss and said, why don't we do this on another project? You've been teaching your students and you've decided to actually teach them like the world is on fire, because it quite regularly is. You might have 2 students who then decide, I don't want to go into conventional practice, I want to go into something else. So we have so much agency that we don't celebrate. In architecture, we like to say there's too many barriers, too many limitations. We can't do anything, we have no control. As an active citizen, you have a hell of a lot of control. As an architect, you've got a lot as well. So we're now going to get off the kind of depressing stuff and into stuff that's a bit more fun. So Rob Hopkins has this really fantastic way of asking what-if questions. Instead of saying, how do we do this, we ask, what if? What if X, Y, or Z was possible? What if this were normal? Because the way that we kind of look at a lot of things in sustainability, we've been taught to look at this kind of 3-legged stool or these 3 pillars of sustainability which are quite blind. So we look at the social, the economical, and the environmental quite often. But this is entirely detached from the kind of the worldview, our cultures, our histories, and our lived experiences. So kind of Daniel Christian Weil says incredibly in designing regenerative cultures that all design is an expression of the kind of our theories about the world, what we think is possible, what is the most efficient, most effective, most restorative thing we think is possible. Because how often have you questioned those horizons? How often do you really stop and think, why do I not think better is possible? It might be down to your experiences, where you've lived, what you've worked on, but we're very, very rarely asked to question this. So we're going to start with the least fun and the least sexy of all of these. So it's, what if each and every country's building regulations actually guaranteed people's homes were comfortable, energy efficient and healthy? Because this is the bare legal minimum. And our building regulations today do not guarantee this. It's still legal to build on floodplains, even though we know sea levels are rising. It's still legal to be kind of, we are still completing buildings today and tomorrow that we full well know are going to need to be retrofitted before 2050. Why is that legal? So why don't we question that a little bit more? Because we have been given a baseline. So in that report in 2018, we were told quite bluntly what was necessary of the built environment. So if we want to be on a pathway that's consistent with 1.5 degrees, building emissions have to be cut by 90% by 2050. So that's not just a few more PVs, that's not just triple glazing, not double glazing, that's a radical transformation, and that could be quite exciting. But at the same time, the baseline for new construction was fossil-free and near zero energy by last year. That is not in any building regulations internationally, and that is what we need to be on a compliant pathway for 1.5 degrees. So if we were to simply to have regulations that guaranteed this, that could be quite a powerful lever to be pulling and actually get things happening a little bit faster. Another thing that's quite important is that 90% of the impact any building has on our environment is determined by the very earliest design decisions. So this is why not architecture important, but so are urban planners, so are policymakers. So if our planning policy doesn't allow buildings to be orientated in the best way to get the most sunlight, if they aren't allowing them to be built kind of in a nice concise way for a form factor, you're already hampering that decision. So 90% is locked in. So if our building regulations don't understand how buildings actually work, we're already kind of fucking things up straight away. because better is already possible. So you've all probably seen this. It's done the rounds quite a lot. This is the RIBA Stirling Prize Award-winning project, Goldsmith Street. That was Michael Rich's. So this is Passivhaus standard social housing. So housing that's designed to eliminate, to drive down fuel bills, to make them cheaper to live in, to give a more comfortable and healthy quality of life. This already exists. This is already possible. So the kind of design of these buildings had to take into account their natural the landscape, the layout, and this can already be done. Planning policy should be encouraging this, not hampering it. But the way things are, it's still that little bit more difficult. So just to explain what Passivhaus is very quickly, because the word's being thrown around a hell of a lot, and it doesn't make much sense unless it's explained. So there's 5 key principles around Passivhaus, apart from passive design principles. So your building's incredibly well insulated and very airtight, sort of like a blanket around the building. You're also trying to more efficient windows, typically using MVHR systems, and you're eliminating things called thermal bridges from the building at junctions, etc. and elsewhere. So we're also going to look at how our buildings are getting on in Scotland, because that's where we are. So in the past year, about 14,000 homes have been built. Only 8 of these are to the highest possible gold standard of energy efficiency, which means that the bare legal minimum is simply not good enough. And we are not talking about this in enough places, because this affects everyone. This affects people. People are moving into homes and finding themselves unable to heat them. Fuel poverty is absolutely rampant. And 40% of any amount of money we spend on healthcare costs is entirely down to our built environment. So good building regulations are essentially a public health strategy. But these dots are just not being connected in government today. And this is something that we cannot escape from. Everything we design is going to have an impact on people's health. So that's an argument we really need to be making, not just with bosses, but with any person commissioning buildings. Because ultimately, buildings are for human habitation or use. They are conveniently used as stock exchange and gold standard these days, but they are sometimes used for people. So we're going to look at something a little bit more fun. So building regulations aren't exciting, and I really appreciate that. Thank you for not leaving. But we're going to look at where we learn and where we're teaching the next generation now. So what if each and every college, nursery, school, and university building and its wider campus was actually envisioning as a learning resource, showing what's possible? Because if we're bringing up the next generation and they're in really buildings that have not been designed for the future, that's a real hindrance. They're in the same boat as us. They do not think better is possible. But today, incredible things already are. So this is the first ever self-sufficient public school in South America, in Uruguay. So this is an earthship. So earthships are an incredible thing that we've been able to do since the 70s. So these are self-sustaining, passively designed buildings that use a thermal mass and orientation to warm themselves using a thicker wall, but at the same time they recycle water multiple times. So they capture their own water and recycle it. They also grow their own food. So all of these things about urban farming being very utopian, very impossible, this can be done, and these can also be done in the New Mexico desert very, very effectively. But this doesn't have to be what everything looks like. That's just the one very far out example. So this is the Earth Trust's Earth Lab as well. So this is a building designed to illustrate to children learning what is possible and what can be done. So it's got a green roof. It's built from straw bale walls with truth windows to let them see. It's got rammed earth walls inside. It's built from engineered timber. It's really just showing children what's possible and creating a really beautiful built environment at the same time and celebrating what learning can really be. We then have the Centre for Alternative Technology, which, as many people know, is really real hub for learning about sustainable construction in the UK. So that's in McAulay in Wales, which I hope I pronounced right. Sorry if I offended anyone. But this is a whole campus designed to envision what a lower carbon future can look like. The Zero Carbon Britain report that was carried out here has already shown we have all the technology that we need to operate as a zero carbon country. That's also not a public conversation yet. But this is the WISE building, and it's really illustrating that you can create beautiful spaces for people to learn from materials we don't typically use or think are possible of doing it. And then there's one of my favourite buildings of all time. That's the Birchsky School Science Wing. So the really lovely thing about this is a science classroom designed to teach children science, to be an armature for their learning. So inside there's a green wall, outside there's allotments, and there's solar panels. They can see how these work, they can do experiments, but this is designed to the living building challenge standard. So I'll quickly jump into what that is. So this is very similar to the graph before, but the Living Building Challenge is a certification that is only given to buildings that are really aiming for that positive environmental impact. So they are non-toxic, they generate more than 100% of the own energy they use, they capture their own water, they don't have toxic chemicals in their makeup at all, and they really have equity and kind of really appreciating people at the soul of them. And probably the loveliest thing about this building is that because one of the children drew a picture of wanting a river for his classroom, they worked that into the building. So this is what a rainwater harvesting system looks like when you want children to be able to do experiments on the water as part of a science lesson in a primary school. So in integrating this sort of thinking, and all school buildings should be armatures for children's learning. So why are they not looking at a beyond net zero future? So that's just a kind of a little bit of a what if question. So now we're going to go back to the fun stuff. So you're going to do some more talking and I'm going to shut up. So we're now, instead of just a little bit of active listening, we're going to do group discussions. So really, you can, with people you've not spoken to yet, so we can do a little bit of getting up and moving. So how and where can you share what you know with other people? How can you share the knowledge you've accumulated? In what forums? But I'd really like it if you spoke to people you didn't know. So we'll make this as fun as possible. I'll give you like 30 seconds to get started, then I'll hit the timer. And just kind of 5-10 minutes of how can you share what you already know. So we've heard from ACAN so far, and there's events have been done, there's been kind of invitations for policy, but how could you do that in your own work? So I'm now going to stop, and it's over to you guys, and we'll get 2 people to feedback from their groups, and I'm entirely prepared to sit and wait until we get 2 volunteers. So have fun, and please get stuck in. Thank you very much. Cheers. Oh, thank you very much. Have a great evening. it's fantastic. Yeah, I just always find that when you speak at people for an hour, it's not the same. But you create the space for it and you let it run. Oh, no worries. Oh, no worries. I've done quite a few. This is like 100%. I've done other speaking at civics also. The best way to get people to remember something is if it's difficult to get caught up in it, articulate and share. And it's just fun. How often I know that first maybe where it's not happening, and I'm just going to go like a bit. It's just a nice way of giving people a space inside something to say, I can do that, so I've done this. It's just more fun. It's also, no one expects to come to an admin. That's the most fun. Yeah. Oh yeah. I'll give it another couple and we'll pull it back. Another 2 or 3 minutes and I'll get back. All right, we're going to wind these up slowly, another kind of minute or so, just to make sure I actually finish by 6 o'clock. Right, just start to wind down kind of slowly, and we'll get back to stuff as well. All right, time's up. We're going to continue and go on to the last 2 parts, and then we're going to wrap things up for the evening as well. So thank you very much for playing ball and not ignoring me and actually doing this. Cheers. Fuck. I think I've lost the room. Yes. I was going to continue, but I don't think I've got anyone's attention yet. This is great. This is being streamed. Oh, fantastic. I love this. Oh, great. I don't actually care. Boom. All right, we're going to continue just to make sure we finish on time. So we're going to go through just another 1 or 2 just to really kind of highlight what's already possible. So even to ask another really, really kind of common sense question, what if we were to transition from building with materials that we know are bad for our health and the planet to using ones that are actually good for life and landscapes? So we know that 40% of the money that we spend on healthcare is entirely due to what we build and how we build it. So what if we simply changed that and that was the bare minimum? So when we start to look at building materials that are toxic, these have been increasing quite rapidly since the kind of 1940s, 50s. So in 2012, there were about 52,000 materials being used. Only 1% of them had ever been tested against human health. So we still don't actually know the impact of what's happening to our health because of what we're building. But better is already possible, and there's some really lovely examples of this as well. So this is Lilac in Leeds. So this is a co-housing scheme that is designed to be as kind of low impact as possible to let people live in a more kind of environmentally friendly way. And you can't tell straight away from looking at it, unless you've seen this similar slides before, but this is built from prefabricated straw bale panels. So these are really fantastic things to build with, because not only do they sequester a huge amount of carbon, they're actually really fantastic for our health, so they help to kind of moderate things. But straw bale buildings don't necessarily need to look like kind of Kevin McLeod's favourite term, hobbit houses. They can look beautiful and really contemporary as well. So this is Old Holloway. And this was a self-built home to kind of Passivhaus standards that, again, was also built using straw bale panels, but a different system. But loads of these systems are also Passivhaus certified. So if you specify these and you're specifying them correctly, you've got an incredibly good chance of actually getting Passivhaus certification, and they're 98% compostable. So only 2% of them is problematic in the slightest. We can then move on to more kind of school buildings and other ways to look at materials. So all the materials used in the Enterprise Centre were all locally sourced, but it's also quite importantly been designed to have a lifespan of over 100 years. So typically buildings in Europe have an average lifespan of 42 years, and 65 years is considered to be a long lifespan building. When in Scotland we've been able to build castles that last 2, 3, 4, 500 years or more, and we understand how buildings work. The fact that we're allowing that to be legal is an outrage. And there is no anger about this in the industry at the moment. This is something that could very, very easily engage a lot of people, because we don't speak about it often enough. We then move into materials like hempcrete. So this is instead of, it's not a replacement for concrete, going to put that disclaimer in straight away. It's a bioaggregate. So this is a kind of mixture of hemp, lime, and water. And you can do really beautiful things with it, but it's really good for your health. It's non-toxic, it sequesters carbon, it's insulating, and it's got a thermal mass to it. So it's a pretty good all-round material for new build. It's really great for working with existing buildings. But it can also be used in very commercial, very kind of mainstream projects. So this is a Marks & Spencer. It's actually built using hempcrete panels that you can't really tell from the photograph. But this gets the best feedback from their staff on what it's like to work in the building, because it's significantly healthier, and it's better for their customers to be in as well. In France, they're already starting to specify this for social housing and kind of retrofit and new build terms. So this is not utopian. This is something already happening in a really great large scale. And there's articles been written about this. So if you look at Grist's article on it, on public housing, you can read that as well. There's also just changing what we put on the walls, a very, very small change. So if we were to use clay plasters as opposed to gypsum, we can take some kind of heavy metals out of things, but also make healthier built environments. But not just to talk about the health, we can tie it into carbon. So we heard about embodied carbon in the last presentation, and that's an incredibly significant thing that's currently not regulated in the UK. But when we compare the amount of carbon that you don't use, when you don't emit when you use clay as opposed to gypsum, there's about 2.4 kilograms difference per square metre, which doesn't sound like much, but when you consider the specification of an entire social housing scheme, an entire university campus, that's a hell of a lot of carbon dioxide you are not emitting simply by not putting a material on the wall and specifying something else. So these are really quick and easy changes we can be doing straight away. There's also things like rammed earth, so literally using what's already on the site to build monolithic walling, which has been used kind of for thousands of years and has been used in a contemporary context. There's en masse and engineered timber, which we're starting to see more and more, kind of around, especially kind of out with the UK. We're not that great with it. But these are kind of engineered timber panels that can be used to be structural, so you can take away the excuse of specifying concrete. But it can also be used in kind of conservation applications or retrofit. So this was a church that was unused, which had been turned into a museum simply by using this kind of engineered timber insert. So it gives it a little bit of a new lease of life in a nice contemporary sense. But in Scotland, we've got other examples as well. There's a technology called brechdapple or dibbelam, where you've got these softwood kind of timber planks that are dibbled together. So this building sequesters 200 tons, just to double check, don't get it wrong, 200 tons of carbon dioxide just in the timber in that one building. This was possible in 2003. Today we're in 2021. The fact this has not been normalised in 18 years is, again, an entire outrage. So we're going to now go to the final one. So we talk about a just transition a lot, and especially in Scotland. Typically we look at a just transition as moving from our kind of current economic and carbon-powered system towards one that's more equitable, more just, and better for the planet, that has kind of climate justice at its core. So what if governments actually began to embrace the opportunities for a just transition by caring for the buildings that are already standing up? Because there's about 30 million of them in the UK alone. So 80% of the buildings we're going to use in 2050 are already standing up around us right now. So we can't solve all the problems we have, all the kind of interlocking crises of the climate crisis and social problems by just building hundreds and thousands of new zero carbon buildings. We have to work on what already exists. But we're not very good at letting them stand up either. So in the UK, we knock down 50,000 buildings every single year. So that's after we declared a climate emergency. So when you consider the amount of embodied carbon in a building, we wipe out one of them every 10 minutes on average in the UK. So again, that's something that we are not speaking about. It's not in our climate conversations. It's very rarely even, it's not in political conversations. So this is something that has to be spoken up about significantly louder. So instead of knocking buildings down, if you retain what already exists, you save about 55 to 75% of the carbon emissions. So on paper, that if embodied carbon was to be regulated, it would be significantly harder for buildings to be demolished and to be rushed out as well. So that's one thing to remember as we go. But just for a slight sense of scale for how many jobs and how many people would need to be employed to fully retrofit our built environment in the UK, we would need about 1,650,000 more people in the retrofit industry alone. That's more people than the oil sector employs in the UK probably. I've not checked that, but it's probably true. But at the same time, the more we do this, the less excuses we have for new oil fields. There's currently 40 of them being proposed by the UK government whilst they're holding COP and whilst they're really holding back action at COP as well. So when you consider that our built environment and building regulations and retrofit are effectively a public health strategy and climate strategy, an economic strategy, all at the same time, it makes absolutely no sense that this is being currently held up. So in Glasgow, we've got some really great examples of this as well. So this is the Woodside multi-storey flats. So these were flats that were thought to be retained. They were meant to be demolished, but were kept because the residents loved to live there. And that doesn't often get included in the story of why it's great now. So by using exterior measures, not one person was displaced from the flats, and they were able to upgrade them to an almost Passivhaus standard. This could be replicated very, very, very easily, and the fact that it's not already being rolled out by kind of government into other similar buildings is again an entire outrage because it's been proven to be possible. But very recently as well, we had the first ever certified living building that's a retrofit. So this means that existing buildings can actually be turned into net positive buildings. So net zero is not the best we can do. We can do far beyond net zero, and ArcNexus proves that's entirely possible. So this was a really inefficiently built warehouse building that is now net positive, generates more energy than it uses, and recycles its own water and captures it as well. But again, we have to be really, really succinct about this. So the way we use resources has to become circular, because the mitigation strategies we like to talk about very often, so energy efficiency and renewables, they can only get us halfway to carbon neutrality. That's the blunt fact that has to be said. We cannot get there unless we change how we use resources, how we retain buildings, how we specify. If we need to stop demolishing things and consider that as well. Just double check we've got enough time for more audit. We don't think we have time for this one. So I was going to get you to do some more of this, but if I'm going to finish on time, we're just going to jump to the end and do the fun bit. So we'll ignore that. That was great, and we're doing well. But just to kind of pull all this into one thing before one final little personal exercise. So Rob Hopkins put really quite succinctly and quite kind of beautifully as well. So one of the fundamental challenges is that we really need to be able to imagine a possible, feasible, and actually a delightful version of the future where things turned out okay. So not the utopia, not Waterworld, not Mad Max. We need to maybe able to imagine a future where things are better, where people are living in homes that are actually healthy for them. People are not working themselves into the ground. Fuel poverty doesn't exist because fuel poverty is not a technological problem. Fuel poverty is a political choice that's not being acted upon. So if we want to imagine a better future, we need to start taking the time to do that. So that's what we're going to do to close. So I'm not here for applause. I want 5 minutes of everyone just to take a little bit of time personally and just think to yourself, in your day-to-day life, what does 2025 look like if every little thing we jump through, all these possible things become normal? So, but what actions are necessary to get us, as a kind of society, a civilization, as a planet, from here to there? And I've said quite often, technology is not the problem. We've quantified this. So 62% of the changes we need to get to net zero in the UK are behavioural and societal. So everyone can now take a nice quiet few minutes to listen to the cars going by and just imagine what that future looks like. So I know you might not have been asked to do this before. I was never asked to use my imagination in architecture school, but we're going to do that, and then we'll just wrap things up. So we're going to have a quiet little pause, and you're going to take a bit of time to imagine what is the future going to look like, and what's necessary to get us to a greener one. So if people want to space out and give themselves space, that's great. However you're comfortable, and we'll just take a 5-minute pause, and then we'll wrap things up. Right, slightly short of 5 minutes to make sure we finish on time. But yeah, so just really to reaffirm, we've seen all these things are already possible. We have so many solutions in the built environment that do not get airtime in climate conversations or in COP26. But beyond COP26, we can normalize this, and this can be pushed forward significantly. But this is not just a slight tweaking of the system. This is entirely reimagining it. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you for actually doing the audience participation as well. So have a great evening, and I'm going to chuck across to Becca to wrap things up. Cheers.
I am literally going to take a minute just to say thank you to everyone who's come along to the Built Environment Day. I actually had a really depressing start to the day where I went to the New York Times Climate Hub and listened to people talk about renovation from a mortgage perspective and insurance perspective. And it's been really nice to end the day on some positive thoughts about technologies we already have and things that we can do as architects and designers to really make change. I'd like to say thank you to ACAN and Anthropocene Architecture School at Scott for really bringing great content to finish up Built Environment Day. And thank you to you for coming to the Landing Hub and the Sustainable Glasgow Landing. And have a lovely evening. That's all I wanted to say.